Thanks, Nick. And open it up from the floor. Any comments, questions? The only way we can begin this is by beginning the discussion, no matter how many there are at the beginning. We don't claim, as talking about socialism, to be even the beginning of this, but we want to be a part of the process. And as Nick said, for Marxists and Socialists from all sorts of backgrounds to come together to begin the argument for a mass socialist communist party, for a new mass workers' party. So, anybody want to jump in? I know that there's somebody here who's got to leave. Yes, because I know you've got to leave quite soon. So
thanks for that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's very hard to respond to such a lengthy thing so quickly. So I want to just pick up several effectively isolated points rather than collective response. First of all, very early on, you referred to groups of Marxists coming together. Very much something that happened in the 90s around the network of socialist alliances and the Socialist Alliance, where the bulk of the larger left groups did, to a greater or lesser extent, sit in the same place for 12 months or so. I think that's a wrong starting point in a very important way. Not that those groups aren't important, that's not what I mean, but there are now much larger layers of people who have not gone through the experience of socialist groups. Very different from the situation that there was, when I was first an activist in the 70s and the 80s, where a lot of the struggle was taken through various Marxist socialist organisations. So there are now much more broader networks. People sometimes just single issue, sometimes straight anti-capitalists, but doing one thing. So I think one of the questions that any future organisation's got to address is how it does relate to those people and how they see the class struggle. That was the first point. The second one, I think, I said there was separate points. Now there's separate points. You did say a number of reasons why you thought Corbyn failed, was weak, and whatever. I agree with those that you made, but I think one thing that rarely gets commented on, which to me was very important at that time, and still is that there was not a mass movement on which something more radical could base itself, or a mass movement that could defend something more radical. I think Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party by a bizarre accident of the electoral rule, and the fact there were several 100,000, largely younger people, who were willing to fork out a few quid to vote in the election, but were not collectively organised a lot of the time. Rarely, if ever, in reality, joined the Labour Party. And so there was an expression, we need change, coming through that vote, but it wasn't borne out by anything on that scale of the participants in it. And of course, I'll say these are separating points. That does to some extent relate back to my first point, which is there are large numbers of people who have got a different view, maybe not revolutionary Marxist, socialist, however you want to go, that are very much questioning the society. And I think that is a target area where we've got to go to. Final point is, I do think we have to be more detailed about what we mean by socialism. I mean, I'm actually very reluctant these days to use the word socialism, taking your point about communism, socialism, and not use the word eco-socialism. Because I think there is a shift in the nature of socialism to the way that Lenin or Trotsky or whoever might have understood it decades ago, which was more production, overcoming poverty, more production. There is an awareness now of the limitations of how the globe can be exploited for human needs, and that needs to be very heavily recognised. It also has to be, what you mean by socialism has to be clarified in another way, around how it relates to women's liberation, blacks' liberation, all those sort of, sometimes are dismissively, I think, wrongly referred to as identity politics. We need to be very overt about how socialism incorporates those sectors who might be mobilised entirely around their issues as trans people or women or black or whatever, who are only beginning perhaps to make links with the more traditional workers' movements. So I think we have to be clear that we see them as in. And the reason why that's worth saying at this time is that there is a growing sentiment of people who've got this almost old white men factory concept of the working class, and are really, I think, getting what they mean by the working class upside down and wrong. Last point, and possibly a difficult one, and that is the situation that's arisen politically over the last, well, in some sense, in the last 2 or 3 decades, which has been a tendency of socialists, because they are rightly opposed to NATO and want to defeat NATO, taking very questionable stances on the situation in various countries. The strongest one at the moment is obviously Ukraine, where there has been a complete unwillingness by most of the British left to try and make links with and stand with the organised working class trade union and socialist movements in Ukraine, because they are so correctly wanting to fight against NATO that they can't see where the starting place of our international solidarity is not which bunch of rival imperialists we think is better or worse in a particular country, but actually what does the working class movement in that country want, and how do we solidify with it? Now, some of these, I think, are primary questions, some of them are secondary, and I think your point about the debate should be within the party is right in a very broad sense, I accept that. But some of these are going to be quite difficult, I think, in the near future in terms of identifying where we are, because there are so many diverse pressures, new organisations, new projects, and pinning themselves sometimes quite distinctly differently on some pretty important questions. Thanks. I'm sorry for having to then shoot out the door.
No, it's much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Can I just, I'm just going to take the opportunity at this point just to switch the microphones if we can, just because comrades who are watching online are struggling to hear us through the microphone that we have. So comrades watching online, what we're going to do is we're just going to end this stream and then start again, hopefully with the same link, but with a new microphone, and then hopefully you'll be able to hear. So we'll end there, and hopefully we'll be back in a minute.
Apologies for the pause whilst we try to improve the volume for those who are following the live stream of this. So nothing's happened in between other than.
Sorry,
Oh, they can't hear me. Okay.
they won't have realised that it's a new link until they've seen it on Facebook.
Talking to people who are here.
So
Right, so Kirsty is watching and says thank you, the sound is better.
Okay, great.
So let's
press on. And thanks for your patience, comrades online who are waiting whilst we took the measures to improve the sound. Hope that's worked.
That's it. So who's going to come in next?
So Steve. Yeah.
Steve. Just let's move this. Is that better?
Yeah.
I don't think it is appropriate.
No, all right.
Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. Fire away.
Yeah, so I was going to just a little bit, wasn't intentionally, but leading up to what Chris was talking about with regards to, in particular, it was the Ukraine war, but other issues as well, is the inability of the left to unify, well, the communist left particularly, to unify, has had like a very corrosive effect on like the actual politics, both in terms of the ability to express communist politics to people who are not already within the movement, but also on the actual movement itself. And I think I mentioned Ukraine. I think the thing that came most obviously to me was the US election, where the central problem really for the left is establishing sort of working class, a class-independent sort of movement that's independent of the two main kind of capitalist parties. Where at present, because it's even the issue of getting a third party, some sort of third party candidate in the election was split between a number of different candidates across different areas, and also, so you end up with a situation where there is no real viable position that you can put forward for the here and now in relation to the immediate US election, apart from either both third party for one of these two candidates. You have like the Green Party are very unsatisfactory in lots of ways. Then you have some other smaller candidates, or it's both the lesser evil, both the Democrats, which will supposedly defeat the far right in America. In practice, it'll I would argue probably postpone, if a Democratic victory in 2024 would have postponed that rather than defeated it outright. But again, it's this problem of a left which is just splintered and set between different groups that can't put forward any sort of central unified political opposition. The result is just politics that just can't get through to a large group of people, really. And in some respects, it's similar with, in a very different sense, with the Ukraine war, and I'd also argue with the ongoing genocide in Gaza as well, where we can't, because of the inability to organise properly into a party, to actually have the resources, to be able to pool resources, to be able to centralise our efforts onto certain questions. You end up with a situation where the role of the British and American working class, which is, it is central to both these questions in terms of the ability to stop arms shipments in, going to Israel or to Ukraine, but also, the efforts of the Palestinian left or the Ukrainian left. Understandably, in those situations, they end up tagged along to their own ruling classes because of the absence of, ultimately of a serious party which can actually take a serious, strong kind of hold with the working class. And also, and again, it's sort of, although we're talking primarily about Britain in a lot of these cases, a major problem is how the amount of splits and splinters have then reproduced themselves on an international level, which has created, like an even greater problem, particularly when it comes to issues that are on a kind of continental scale or global scale. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I think that's probably all.
Thank you very much.
A lot of ground covered there, and thanks so much for that introduction. I think one of the things that struck me in terms of the points raised in the introduction, but also in terms of the challenges of the last few years, perhaps the last 5 to 10 years more realistically, is how our position of isolation and weakness has made it a lot more challenging to argue for our politics, and how that's really a challenge that we need to confront. And I think Stephen's right, and I think some of that was raised by the contribution that Chris made before he had to leave to go on a demonstration. Now, in fairness to Chris, he didn't fully flesh out what he meant, and so I don't want to misrepresent his position. But I think if I've understood it correctly, he said that we need to focus on what the working class, the organised working class in a particular country, say about an issue. Well, that may be right, but it may also be that there are situations where the organised working class, however it expresses itself, may have reached conclusions which are wrong, or which are antithetical to the kind of change that we want to see towards a communist society and all of the things that we need to do in order to get there. And so if it is the case, and I think this would be quite a bold claim to make, but if it is the case that the Ukrainian organised working class says that they should support, and by extension we should support, the war aims of the current Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian capitalist class, well, I would disagree with that. I think that would be an example of them getting it wrong. And so I don't think that's necessarily our starting point. But of course, given the real weakness of our trend, if you can put it that way, of people who want to revitalise and rehabilitate communist politics among the working class movement, among the left, it's difficult to argue for that sometimes, and we find that ideas that are contrary to that really kind of gain a foothold, gain an audience within the movement and among the people that we're trying to organise for very understandable reasons, because there are various good arguments or persuasive arguments, if I can put it that way, that people might be attracted to or persuaded by when somebody says this is a war about Ukraine's right to exist, this is a war of national self-determination. It's easy to understand, isn't it, why there might be people who are persuaded by that. And so we face a real challenge in not taking things for granted, not simply assuming that people are going to agree with us, but continually making the same arguments again and again and slowly, patiently persuading. And so I think it's right to acknowledge how far back we are in that sense, because we are really quite a long way back. In that same vein, I thought there was one point which I wanted to just explore a bit in Nick's introduction, because Nick said, I think I heard right, if you want to make the economy work as a capitalist economy, then you have to reduce tax, you have to limit the ability of workers to strike, and you have to reduce wages and so on. Well, I think clearly that there is a strong tendency in that direction in the way that the system works, but we also need to think about how to make those arguments, and that includes confronting the arguments of people who say that sometimes it's in the interests of the ruling class to direct or manage or coax the system in a direction which happens to coincide with improving things for the working class, at least to a very limited extent, because of course that kind of theory was the dominant one in the Corbyn movement while it held the leadership of the Labour Party. We saw it expressed through the various policy proposals and the arguments, which I think Nick referred to as well, put forward principally by John McDonnell about the need to improve and revitalise infrastructure, something that would serve the interests of both the capitalist class, because then they can do business better, they can establish new businesses, but also it would help the working class as well. It's rooted in, well, various people, but Mazzucato's idea of the interventionist state. We need to think about how we argue with this, argue against it if necessary, because clearly it seems to me, and I'd be interested to know what people think about this, what Nick thinks in response as well. Clearly every system, and the capitalist system is no exception, every system needs a safety valve in order to function. And it also needs to ensure the smooth running of its own machinery. And so at least sometimes, or to some extent, for the capitalist system, that means it needs a healthy workforce. It means a working class that can reproduce itself, which is not on the brink of starvation, because those workers are simply not going to be productive. It's right, I think, that many of the significant pro-working class reforms in the post-war consensus, which are presented as examples of what can be achieved under the current system, it's downplayed routinely. It's downplayed how much they were the result of pressure from working class struggle, or the fear of the ruling class that they would come under that kind of pressure from the organised working class. And so the creation of the NHS is the most obvious one. But the ruling class does sometimes do that kind of thing of its own volition as well, in order to make its own machinery function more effectively. And so it does sometimes do things and institute policies and change the system, the workings of the system, at least superficially, in ways which happen to benefit the working class. I think the classic example in this country is at the start of the 20th century, the British state finding itself embroiled in what became the Boer Wars, and needing to call up thousands or hundreds of thousands of young working class men to fight, and finding that they were too sick, suffering from rickets and all other kind of horrible diseases. They were simply too sick to be sent to fight. And you can pretty much draw a straight line from that to the creation of national insurance, the predecessor of the NHS. So we need to think, I think, about how to make those arguments in a nuanced way, because again, we will be, I think, our ideas, our trend will be a minority, a tiny minority within the working class movement for a long time to come, unless things go exceptionally well for us, but much better than expected in the next period. And we need to think really carefully about how to counteract the arguments of the reformists in a nuanced and persuasive way, and take the arguments at their highest in order to be more persuasive ourselves. Because I think that kind of nuance and that kind of persuasive argument is actually one of the things that's really lacking in a lot of the outputs of the existing Marxist organisations, and it's something that will, of course, develop as time goes by, hopefully, as our time and experience goes by, and we build a bigger, more resilient organisation with experience of writing and putting across our ideas. But also there are things we can do about it now, and it's part of approaching things from, insofar as possible, from a shared perspective, a shared understanding of what is the system under which we live, what does it mean when social democrats put forward a platform for managing capitalism, which to what extent are they correct, to what extent is what they put forward achievable, and we need to approach it in that kind of careful way, rather than simply saying, well, whatever they're putting forward, you're going to come up against the capitalist system, and it's not going to let you do it. I think it probably needs a bit more than that, is my instinct, even though ultimately the conclusion is the same. They are not going to be allowed to reform capitalism. I think we need to think about how to win people over. I'm going to stop there. There's so many more points, but I've talked for long enough, so I'll pause there.
Thanks very much, Ed. Kat, just one sec, we'll turn the camera. That's so brilliant. Thanks.
Yeah, I would agree with what Ed said. The behaviour of a capitalist economy, I definitely think would be kind of the early 20th century. The experience of the Cold War directly informed sections of capital who campaigned for intervention into working class life, sort of even before the Lloyd George government. I can't remember what the legislation was called, but into like the hygiene and conditions of the working class, the child rearing behaviours of the working class, and from that perspective, actually at that time, a lot of that was received quite negatively by working class people for obvious reasons. But there was a resistance amongst a lot of kind of friendly society, mutual aid type working class communities that were kind of, I suppose, suppose, engaged in their own provision of these things, and they saw that state intervention clearly as being something to manage their life in the interest of capital, and that they were quite resistant to it on that basis. So there was a political opposition within the working class, even though obviously I think the more significant movement was the working class movement for this provision, but there was also opposition to this. So it was seen as being in the interest of capitalism to deal with productivity crisis, to deal with the security crisis that had been brought on by the Boer War. Obviously, the basis was being laid for World War I, both the economic competition of the European states, but also because of the move towards the draft. It was seen as representation of national vigour, and that kind of intersecting of the security and the economy was seen as a crisis by capitalism in that kind of early 1900s period, before we even had kind of the real sort of welfare state that we're looking at today. So yeah, I would absolutely kind of agree with that. I guess a lot of the sort of social reproduction theory stuff really looks into that, like the social depletion crisis experienced by working class people through the Industrial Revolution, and just basically run working class people down to the bare bones, and what they were able to then provide and put into the system was seen by capitalism to be depleted at that point. I wouldn't really buy all of it, but like the arguments from Karl Polanyi that things move in a kind of pendulum between this sort of hyper extraction, hyper kind of depletion of these resources, and then once they're depleted to a minimum, then a movement is recognised not just within the working class itself or within those at the bottom, but it's also recognised within those at the top of society. So there's a kind of, I suppose, inter-class differences at the top about how we need to respond to this depletion, and then there's movements to then kind of a movement towards protection in society. And that could be represented in social democracy, but it could also be represented in things like fascism, in a way the fascism represents a particular appeal of reining in the excesses of depletion, the excesses of free market, neoliberalism, things like that. And from our side, I suppose I would agree with Ed, if we're not able to counter these arguments and clearly take them at the level that they're presented and be able to articulate something beyond those, but which deals with them as they are. A lot of that, I think we have to recognise a lot of that sentiment, that hyper-capitalism, anti-neoliberalism, it does get sucked up into fascist movements as well as social democratic movements, and we need to be able to respond to that, particularly in this period where those sentiments are live in society. So I do think, I suppose that is an important part of thinking about how we articulate the need for and the basis on which a communist party would be developed, because we need to be able to respond to those arguments as they exist in society. But I guess the most important question that I took from your introduction, Nick, and myself, is the question of how we get from here to there, because I think most of us in this room would agree where there needs to be and what there looks like, but how do we get from here to there? I mean, I've got broad thoughts on it, but I would be more interested to hear what other people thought, I think. Thank you.
Thanks very much. As Ed said, we are a tiny minority, and it is a question of how we get from here to there. And that's why we want to, the reason for this meeting, and not that we think that we, in talking about socialism, will incrementally become the mass party, but it's a question of linking with those, and I am absolutely convinced there are many, many thousands of people who think in the same way, that there is a need to change society, to get rid of capitalism, and it's a question of finding them, because we're not all out putting stuff online or whatever. It's the existing groups, and I think, as Chris said earlier, those many individuals aren't in groups, or indeed have never been in groups because of their age, but that everybody is important in beginning what is not an easy task, but the task of building a mass workers, communist workers' party, whatever we want to call it. It's important. Most people, and I include myself in this, want an easy life, and so and that's understandable. I suggest we want to make things easier for ourselves and for our families. The constant struggle of going to work and then trying to make ends meet. But it's a question, and so it's also a question of individual. We see quite rightly the individual struggles there are of issues, sexism, racism, misogynism. All those things have not gone away under capitalism. So then, of course, those battles do and will continue to take place. But it's a question of uniting everybody in those struggles. Not an easy task, but that the problem is caused by the capitalist system. And of course, we have the obstacle of the fact that the existing so-called parties that are supposed to represent the working class don't, and indeed provide a huge block, in my view, by making people think, well, they're the solution. I don't think myself that when the Labour government was elected in the UK this year, that there was a massive enthusiasm for Labour Party and Labour Party policies. Of course, there should have been if it were a proper party of the working class, but it was a let's get rid of the Tories view, and so it's overcoming those obstacles as well. The role the trade unions are trade union leadership, hard-won battles by the working class in many years ago to establish their own representation, to be able to achieve rights in the workplace. And the people who have become bureaucrats, I call them bureaucrats, the leaders of those unions, by and large, I'm not including everybody, but by and large, have been absorbed by the capitalist system and want to keep their, I'll call it, cushy job, and placating the members so they keep their job, and also keeping the capitalists happy. So it's all about, I'm not saying that every struggle in the unions is going to be right end of capitalism, but that there's no explanation that these are battles that are steps forward, essential in not just protecting the rights that have been achieved, but more rights. So the basics of pay increases and so on, but explaining that this is with the background of the fact that this system will not only never give us the sort of lives we'd like, but we need to get rid of the system, and you can't reform it away, which is the myth that's being presented by people like Corbyn and others, well-meaning, I would describe them, well-meaning liberals. But that's not enough. So it's part of the discussion this afternoon, the second session, as it were, which isn't going to start for a while, but will be on more of how we get from here to there. But I think I would be interested if comrades, both here and online, participating in the meeting, because they can post comments, questions, and so on, would say what they think about that, and how we do it without preempting what's okay. I will read something from Kirsty, who's online. The capitalist system has caused the problem since time began, and has got steadily worse over the years. Also, the hierarchy and the patriarchy have kept us down and oppressed for years. completely agree with that, Kirsty. So I don't know if anybody else wants to chip in. It's not, people don't have to give a speech, they can just say what they think. That's what we're here for.
So I'm going to throw out
Yeah.
two questions that I think everybody here has got views on. Should Marxists simply do what Chris hinted at with the Socialist Alliance, and that is form an alliance or a party with people that are not communists or socialists in the term way that I've outlined it, and inevitably that would mean arguing for a program that is not arguing for a fundamental change, revolutionary if you want to use that word. So that's one question. Secondly, if we need this party, why wouldn't we join one, or why won't you join one of the existing ones?
For my brief.
Ed?
Hi, Vic. First question, should Marxists do something similar to what was done in the Socialist Alliance and form an alliance with those who are not revolutionaries? Well, I think we're always going to have to work with people with whom we have pretty fundamental disagreements. And the ways in which that comes about and the forms that takes and the institutions it happens through will vary in each circumstance. I think the answer to the question is, in short, no. And the reason for that is that if we want a party which is not, to borrow a phrase, not delineated between reform and revolution, then I think there are a couple of things to say about that. One is that it's been tried. It's been tried in the form of left unity in the UK, which is, of course, a very minor effort, but it's also been tried on a much grander scale in the continental parties of the left. And we've seen that, in general, their experience is not only failing to be revolutionary, but also failing on their own terms of achieving the kind of extensive social democratic reforms that they advocate. The reason, I think we don't need to go over again, but the reason is that they are constructed as and orientated towards being parties of government under capitalism, and therefore inevitably will come up against the dictates of the market once in power, because they have no real red lines when it comes to being in government, being in office, as regards their relation to the ruling class. If they had a position that they would simply go into office, try and implement their program, and if they were blocked from doing so, then they would resign, then that would be potentially qualitatively different. It would produce a different situation in the working class. Instead, what we've got is parties such as Syriza backing down from the fight and selling out the fight at a crucial moment, or in the case of Die Linke in Germany, simply never bothering to try and prosecute that struggle at all in reality, simply going into a coalition government at state level, hoping that one day they'll be allowed to do that on the national stage and driving through austerity programs on behalf of their coalition partners. That's where a party that's not delineated between reform and revolution gets us. And of course, if we want to join a party that's vaguely left-wing, in which revolutionaries are allowed to be members and are tolerated, then we could all just join the Green Party, couldn't we? That really poses the sort of existential challenge to any new formation of the broad left. The fact that the Green Party already exists, but also it shows to us the futility of it. And the second question, if we need this kind of party that we are advocating, a mass communist party, well, why not join one of the existing ones? I think to be very blunt, it is the issue of democracy. We have an understanding of how those groups are organised. They're organised, in my view, on a misconception of what is thought to be necessary to organise a revolutionary party. They're based on a conception that in order to organise a revolutionary party, what you need is militarised discipline, in which the central committee, or whatever body you have, hands down the line, and then it's up to the activists, the foot soldiers, simply to go out and try and sell that line to the working class. Internal debate and dissent is extremely limited. We've seen people expelled from their organisations for example, having a view on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which was not shared by the leadership of their organisation. And I think that kind of illustrates quite neatly the ludicrous nature of that sort of type of organisation. The sort of mass democratic communist party that we want, in my view, would be characterised by open debate, by confronting disagreements and having them out as a helpful exercise in clarifying the organisation's own politics in front of the class, not behind the back of the class. And it would be characterised as well by being able to accommodate multiple tendencies and trends and even sharp differences on this or that particular question, which may emerge from time to time, even if those disagreements cause serious problems and serious divisions. It should be an organisation which is capable of incorporating those differences within it, rather than simply a reason for yet another split. And so I think those are my answers to those questions.
Thanks very much, Ed. Does anybody else want to say anything at this stage?
Sorry, may I just come back briefly, because I'm keeping an eye on the comments on YouTube.
I was just going to.
And somebody whose name doesn't appear, but under the user name Political Economy 101, which is something I'm sure we could all benefit from. The RCP is also having this conference in London now. What is wrong with the RCP, so the Revolutionary Communist Party, the new name for what was previously Socialist Appeal? So if anybody has any views on that, that would be interesting.
I suppose as the ex-member,
As you just avoided, I'd give you the option.
Yeah. So yeah, as I was saying, as an ex-member, left about this time last year, I think, well, a lot of the problems I think have already been mentioned in a more general sense. The organisation doesn't really, it doesn't allow really open factions or anything of that nature. And as, you know, as with a lot of organisations, there is a real focus on ensuring that debate is kept internal within, you know, the organisation, not even in the newspaper. It's kind of, yeah, there are lots of people who, across like the global organisation, who have been various reasons expelled for going outside of the, you know, the normal democratic channels, which typically means they've not discussed their differences, you know, in the right place. So they've, you know, they've talked about them slightly more openly than the organisation allows. So, you know, not in a branch meeting or, you know, in a debate at a conference or what have you. I suppose the other kind of slightly more delicate topic, is that the organisation globally has, because of this kind of very bureaucratic kind of apparatus, has had a number of scandals involving essentially sexual abuse, which are kind of the most, like, personally in my view anyway, the most kind of grotesque sort of expression of where these kind of organisations can lead, in terms of, because very clearly all of these scandals are very, very much linked to the way in which the organisation operates, its senior leadership, towards people who are very, very new, who have often been recruited by the person in question. So yeah, it's those in short are the problems, I would say, with the Revolutionary Communist Party.
Alice.
I'm going to say a couple of words. I mean, I feel like I'm about to walk into like an extra spiders therapy session. My name is Alistair, and I've been Justice for 30 years. But no, I mean, yeah, I mean, a couple of things have come from this conversation so far, which I did see the start of it, so it took me a while to grasp what people were actually talking about. But one of them is the question of unity, and the other is questions about what's on the existing groups. In terms of kind of what's on the existing groups, I mean, it is true that the British left has far vertical left, communist left has always been pretty small and pretty fragmented. And this has led in many ways to the problems people talked about here. There's two views you can take of this, which is what I call an idealist view, which is these people have the wrong ideas. They have the wrong ideas about liberalism, they're in the wrong place. Or you could take maybe a kind of overly materialistic determinist view of it, which is like, well, it's the circumstances are all wrong. This is why we haven't grown. And this is the Trotskyist group, is why haven't we grown? Well, the circumstances are wrong. After 100 years of like very small communist groups in this country, I have to say, like, well, maybe that isn't about it. Maybe there is something wrong. I mean, I think the balance between the two of those is actually, yes, some of the ideas are wrong, but actually it's not true that these groups like this are all the way through time. Actually, they change. They get better and they worse. Groups rise, they decline, and that's because circumstances change. It's much easier to be much more open and democratic in the 70s when we were part of a vibrant working class movement where lots of people were challenging everything. People are going to challenge the organisation when that's happened. When you're in a period where, like, actually pretty defeated, the working class movement is not in a good place and very defensive, you're inevitably going to get that's going to wash back into organisations. And in fact, the more detached they become from a vibrant working class movement, the more independent they're going to become. So, I think we need to kind of balance explanation of what's happened with a lot of the British left, rather than that they had the wrong ideas. It's more complicated than we can understand. And I think the central feature is the relationship of organisations to the working class. And to understand that, you have to understand where the class is at any one time. It's much easier to have a socialist organisation where millions of people believe out there in a vague kind of socialism of some sort, a systemic alternative. Millions of people did used to believe in that, and they don't understand that. Which is one of the reasons where there's a discussion going back to what's happened at the start of the 20th century. Yeah, capitalism produced reforms. But if you look back, capitalism really thrived with socialism. There's lots of things they did again and again and again to. It's a reaction to this idea that socialism is which they have to deal with and reply to, which really isn't the case today either. That's no longer, socialism doesn't seem like a systemic alternative in that kind of way. Anyway, I don't want to ramble on, but just to tackle the question of should Marxist communists form a party with people who are Marxist communists in the same kind of way? People I think he mean probably who stand for the total overthrow of the capitalist system by revolution. The comrade here said, the problem is there is a clear differentiation between revolution and reform. And this is right, revolution and reform are two very distinct ideas, very distinct paths in kind of ways. But if you want a historical example of an organisation which actually fluffed this question, where there wasn't a clear differentiation between revolution and reform, it was the Second International. Now, the Second International had many problems, and obviously led to many of the parties of the Second International people within them betrayed working class during the First World War. But the Second International also gave birth to the Third International, a series of mass organisations. So if we're looking about how to build mass organisations in a condition where we're very, very, very small, we should probably look back to the past where people managed to do this, rather than obsessing about what very, very small organisations in this country have done over the last 30, 40 years.
Thanks, Alistair. It's really, yeah, very good contribution. Thank you, everybody, for the contributions we've had so far. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in. Yeah, Vic. The camera's already on you, so you're
just follow on what Ashley said. I think the importance is around political independence of the working class, but particularly socialists and communists. So, for example, today in Manchester, there are rallies for climate and personal movements that we're involved in. But I do think that we also need to have our eyes as well as on building work towards a mass communist party, because I think sometimes there can be not too much emphasis, but too little emphasis on the work we do as communists together, and the idea that working with movements, which we should do, that social concepts will spontaneously develop out of those movements, I just don't think it is true. So I do think we have to do both, where we are intervening in those movements, at the same time we are keeping an eye on left grouping and toward building the party that we desperately need. Because in the long term, having that socialist political independence means that we can more strategically but more effectively intervene in those movements further. So those two things are really closely related. But I do think, across the net, across the sort of socialist groups, there's a disconnect between sort of the socialist movement and the workers' movement and movements around race and anti-imperialism. What's needed is a party that can connect those things together and intentionally develop those comrades who are involved in climate justice, anti-race imperialism, and develop them into communist chaos.
Anybody else? So I think one of the problems has been that because of the isolation of small communist socialist groups in the past, because as Alistair said, of everything is in its context, and it's what's going on in the working class and the working class movement, whether it's times of retreat or moving forward, that in times when it was difficult in this country, the upholding the ideas of communism, socialism was very difficult. And I think what developed was a sort of bunker mentality for the groups, and that anybody who wasn't with them was against them. And then you've got this idea of having to control the membership, and that of course is fatal. So we'll take a break now. We're going to close the live link for those who are on the live link. We will reopen it at 1:45, and there will be a new link which you can find on Nick's Facebook page, Nick Reck's Facebook page. So I hope everybody who's on the link will rejoin us at 1:45.